Welcome to this Killick Explains video, and welcome to the result of quite a topical poll. And this time I asked the question, with inflation seemingly fairly rampant in the UK and the US, to name but two, should central banks such as the Bank of England act or do nothing? So let's go to the poll and then we can talk around some of the results and also some of the jargon. So what should the Bank of England do next? Now 26% of you, roughly speaking, think the answer is nothing at all. 28% of you, on the other hand, think the Bank of England should be reducing what's called QE and or putting it into reverse, which is QT or quantitative tapering. Then around 29% of you think the Bank of England should be raising interest rates. And finally, 17% of you think they should be doing both. Now let's just talk through these. So the problem essentially is that inflation, as I say at the time this video was shot, which is October 2021, is running fairly rampant. It's well above target in the UK, well above target in the US, and showing signs of going further potentially. So in the do nothing camp are people who basically see this as a temporary blip. Yes, growth has accelerated quite impressively post-pandemic, and thank goodness for that, some would say, but inevitably, supply chain issues, consumer confidence being dented by tax increases in the UK, for example, not to mention the possibility of central banks acting, all of these things will naturally slow economies, and there'll be no need for central banks to actually take any action. And the best bet would be, rather than killing off the growth we've seen, they should in fact do nothing at all. However, that isn't the majority view on my poll. A lot of people think that what should be happening is the Bank of England should be putting its quantitative easing measures introduced in the wake of the financial crisis into reverse. Now, just a quick reminder, I've done videos on this elsewhere, but quantitative easing essentially has two sides to it. Central banks create extra liquidity, liquidity, and that is designed to find its way into the hands eventually of consumers and or companies via banks. The mechanism is the central bank buying bonds. These can be government bonds and or highly rated corporate bonds, but buying traditional safe havens, if you like, pushing the price up, pushing the yield down, and forcing investors to seek returns elsewhere by taking on more risk. So extra liquidity, combined with forcing investors out of safe havens, is thought to be the way to stimulate growth, and QE, quantitative easing, has been used fairly successfully, some would argue, as a monetary tactic since the financial crisis. But there are those who say this needs to stop. Enough is enough. It's time for quantitative tightening, QT, where essentially bond buying slows, stops, and even potentially goes into reverse gear. Now, some people think that actually interest rates are the most effective tool to combat rising inflation, and the Bank of England should be acting. So what's the mechanism here? Well, in simple terms, if you raise interest rates, you make borrowing more expensive for both companies and consumers. If you do that, they have less money spare, if you like, so consumers spend more on their mortgages, for example. They have less spare, so they buy fewer other things, and the price starts to fall, and inflation drops with it. Now, that might sound like an easy solution, so what are the problems? The first one is we haven't seen any interest rate rises on any meaningful level for many, many years, so there's a shock factor here. And the second one is, how far and how fast do you raise them? Now, the Bank of England has mooted that it might start raising interest rates over a fairly long period from here, but they've got to be careful. Some economists like an interest rate policy to trying to move a brick on a table using a rubber band. You tug once and get no response, you tug harder and get no response, and on the third tug, the brick flies off the table and hits you in the face. So the danger is that if they proceed too quickly with interest rate rises, given how unusual they've been over the last 2 decades, they could slam an economic recovery into reverse. Coupled with fears over supply chain issues, imminent tax rises, Some people may feel that's a step too far, but others are saying no, they do need to act. They need to send a clear signal that they're serious about inflation, because if inflation gets out of the bag, it can be difficult to rein back in again. And that leads me to the people who think they should do a bit of both, raising interest rates and reducing or reversing quantitative easing. And these are people nervous about the fact that inflation has a habit of spiralling out of control if it's allowed to do so. And given that no one really knows how bad things like supply chain issues could get, no one really knows how long the spending splurge post-pandemic could last, both on the side of consumers, and if you look at private equity activity in the corporate world, there are some people saying, let's call a halt now, let's do something about it, using all the tools available to the Bank of England. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't work on the Monetary Policy Committee, so I can't tell you what they're going to do next. But all I can tell you is I wouldn't want to be in their shoes, because interest rate policy and/or what happens to quantitative easing or quantitative tightening over the next 18 months, 2 years, will have a fairly profound effect potentially on investor confidence. To find out more about some of these big bits of jargon I've been mentioning, do feel free to tap into my video library, killick.com/learn. And if you'd like a copy of my equity markets guide, or any other guides for that matter, then do feel free to ping me, editor@killick.com.